Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to put a complete aftermarket suspension underneath a 79 to 04 Mustang. So this video is going to be the complete install, front suspension, rear suspension on a 79 to 04 Mustang from Maximum Motorsport. So the front suspension is their tubular K-member, their control arms, their coilovers. The rear suspension is their Panhard bar, their torque arm, and their coilovers in the rear. So with that said, this video is going to be sort of like the Cliff Notes version of the install, frankly, because most of my subscribers really don't care about this, but it's something I had going on out in my garage, and it was just too big of a topic not to shoot a video on it. So that's why I'm shooting a video on it, but like I said, I'm going to give you guys sort of like the Cliff Notes version of putting this stuff in. And at the end, I'll kind of give you my initial impressions as far as, you know, how it drives, how the car, you know, behaves, and what the difference is before and after. Spoiler alert, it's night and day. It is a different car. So the main reason that the 79 to 2004 solid axle Mustang handles like absolute dog crap is these two upper control arms here. If you look, these two upper control arms actually have two jobs. They're set on an angle, so what that's doing is it's locating the axle left to right, and it's keeping the axle from rotating, you know, forward and back. It doesn't do either one of those jobs that well. If any of you have actually driven one of these cars and actually, you know, pushed one around around a fast corner, you'll know, you'll actually feel the rear end of the car shift in relation to the tires. So the tires will be planted on the ground, and you'll feel the body of the car actually start to shift sideways a little bit. This actually does a couple things. So first of all, it actually causes the front end to steer on its own because you're changing the angle of the rear of the car. So you're not putting any steering wheel input into the steering wheel to go around this corner, and the body does one of these and actually changes the direction of the car without your input. The reason all of this came about was this original suspension design was designed in, believe it or not, started design in 1973. So this original suspension design dates back to the 1978 Ford Fairmont. That car was basically a full-size sort of economy car for the mid-70s, and it had about 115 horsepower. So if you're going to the grocery store, this setup works great. If you're trying to do anything beyond that, it's crap. Okay, so back here on the passenger side, this is looking toward the rear of the car. This is the upper control arm. I've got the axle end unbolted, as you guys can see here, and check out the amount of free play that is in this upper control arm. So first of all, the free play between the sleeve of the bushing and the bolt. That has factory hardware in it, guys. That's the way it came from Ford. Now, if you continue pushing this car around a corner, the axle will move side to side. Now, this is one hand. Look at that amount of deflection that I can put in this upper control arm with one hand. This car weighs 3,400 pounds approximately. What do you think happens when you pitch this car into a corner? It moves a hell of a lot more than what I can do with my one hand. So that is why every 79 to 04 solid axle Mustang, if you push it around a corner and you try to approach the limit, they get extremely unpredictable. So because neither one of these control arms can control this axle that well left or right, Ford tuned these cars with lots of understeers. There's not a lot of rear grip back here, because if there was a lot of rear grip back here, it would cause these bushings to deflect even more and cause this self-steering problem that I was describing about earlier. It would make that even worse if it had more grip. The way you solve this is really two things: Panhard bar, torque arm. So disassembly in my case is pretty minimal. There's no shocks in the back of this car. I'm just popping out the rear springs, and I'm also disconnecting the rear brake lines because I have to bleed the brakes anyway. And if you leave the brake lines connected, the axle will sag down too far and it could rip the brake hose. So you may or may not need to disconnect your brake lines. So first thing you're going to do is take the Panhard bar frame put it up, use a couple stands or jack stands or whatever you have at your disposal to hold it up against the frame. Make sure the bottom edge down here is nice and tight up against the frame. You know, it's not drooping down or kicked up or anything like that. The bottom edge is flat against the frame on both sides. After you get that done, next thing you're gonna do is you're gonna jack up the rear axle. This is why we had to take the springs out. So you're gonna jack up the rear axle so this lower control arm is parallel with the ground. The easiest way to know if the lower control arm is parallel with the ground is you take a measurement from the bolt to the ground and the front bolt to the ground. So you're gonna get this up into place, get the frame up into place, and then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take a plumb bob, put a plumb bob over the axle and get a measurement from the axle bracket to the plumb bob. You'll get a distance from here to here. You're gonna try and get a similar measurement on the opposite end. And you're gonna get a measurement across here, and I'm getting, it's about 4 5/8 from the string to this inside edge right here. Over here on the passenger side, you're gonna do the exact same thing. So you're gonna put the plumb bob over the axle. The plumb bob is gonna go over top of the back of the axle just like it did on the driver's side. And you're gonna come in here and get a measurement from the string to the inside of the Panhard Bar axle mount. And I'm getting about 5 inches. So what you want is you want the passenger side, the mount side, to be between 1/4 inch and 5/8 further toward the back of the car than what it is on the driver's side. So the driver's side, I had 4 5/8, and this is at 5 inches. So that is about perfect. At this point, I'm ready to go through and mark everything, start drilling the holes up in the frame. Now, if you get this Panhard Bar frame in the wrong spot, if you have it too far forward, you're gonna cause clearance issues with your rear sway bar. If it's too far rearward, you're gonna have problems making an exhaust fit. This thing is actually designed to be used with factory tailpipes. I ended up just going to a muffler shop and I just had them bend up a set of tailpipes for me. The chances and the likelihood of you finding something off the shelf that's gonna fit over this Panhard Bar frame mount is pretty slim. So I just went the custom route. As far as the holes, you know, there's a couple different steps that you got to do. So they have frame inserts that you have to go in that actually go inside the frame. So the outer section of this frame, I'm actually going to drill 5/8 diameter holes, whereas the inside of the frame, the inside of the frame toward the middle of the car, only gets 1/2 inch holes. So it's the instructions lay it out very specifically how you're supposed to do this. But yeah, once you get this thing in place, drill your holes and bolt it up. So the last thing you need to do as far as the Panhard Bar is concerned is install the rod. Now, the Panhard Bar rod, you have to install it at ride height. So meaning the ride height of the vehicle, fuel tank, full tank of fuel with the, you know, driver and passenger or whatever, what it's going to be driving down the road. And you want to make this rod level all the way across. Once you have the rod level, the next thing you can do is adjust the length. And when you adjust the length, that'll move the axle left to right underneath the car. So you can make that match that original measurement that you took at the beginning. If you're running a torque arm like I am, you can just center it up underneath the car. So now the Panhard Bar is installed. Next thing I'm going to install is going to be the torque arm in the rear. The torque arm really just lifted up into place, and it has some U-bolts that hold it to the axle tubes. As far as the front end, there's a cross member that we have to weld in to the subframe connectors that connect the front of the torque arm to the chassis of the car. Okay, so the next thing we're going to assemble is going to be this front pivot bolt. So grab this weird looking bolt out of the kit. You're going to do 1 urethane bushing on the front, another one on the back so it kind of looks barrel shaped, and then you're going to take the 5/8 flat washer, large spacer, and you're going to thread this into the end of the tube. You're then going to torque this bolt to 220 foot-pounds. Now at this point we're ready to slide the cross member on. Now before we do that, you want to liberally lubricate this urethane bushing so it doesn't squeak. You're also going to want to lubricate the receiver tube in the cross member, so put some grease inside the tube that goes over top of this. So after you get the cross member partially slid on, go to your toolbox, go get the biggest dead blow hammer that you have and start beating the living crap out of this cross member to go on. It is an extremely tight fit on the bushing. It took me probably the better part of a couple minutes to hammer this thing on all the way because it fits so tight. So I've got the cross member exactly where it needs to be. I've got a clamp over there on the far side kind of holding it in place. When you get this in place, what you want to do is you want to get it as close as you can to the floor without it touching. And what the tech at Maximum Motorsport actually told me was, when I emailed him about the washer issue, what he said to do was actually just take an 1/8 inch drill bit, slide it between the cross member and the floor pan at the tightest point, and then just make the cross member touch the drill bit, weld it in place, and pull the drill bit out. So he goes, you don't want this touching the floor. I'm assuming it's probably, you know, noise and vibration problems if it touches the floor, but you want it as close to the floor as you can get it for exhaust clearance. So the other thing about this cross member is it has to be at a very specific angle. What they want you to do is get an angle finder and put it on the torque arm behind this weld right here. So the measurement that I have is about 4 degrees. It's just under 4 degrees. Now, if I go over here to the cross member, I've got about 0. So let's say, for example, you have a 10-degree upward or downward angle on this tube. When you measure this point back here, it has to be 4 degrees less than what the angle is here. So I hope that makes sense. So this could be 10, it could be 60, it could be whatever. This has to be 4 degrees less than that. So one thing I forgot to mention a second ago, guys, is the cross member that I was setting the angle on. I set all these angles at ride height. So I have the rear end of the car jacked up, sitting at ride height with the springs removed. So I know what angle this cross member needs to be at when the car's sitting on the ground. The other thing about this torque arm is this is what takes the place of those upper control arms. So this torque arm is what's going to keep the axle from pitching upward as you accelerate. This is what controls the axle as far as rotation. The Panhard bar is what controls the axle left to right. So with these two things, you can get rid of those upper control arms completely. The only part that I don't have for the back of this car, and it's been on back order for like 2 months at this point, is a rear sway bar. I'm still waiting on a rear sway bar to come in. But even without the rear sway bar, guys, this car handles absolutely fantastic. Okay, so we're finally getting to the tail end of this thing. So you have to run a bolt through the ears on the axle. Now this one on the driver's side, you just have to enlarge it up to, they say 9/16. I don't have a 9/16 drill bit, so I'm just going to use a 1/2 inch bit. It's a 1/2 inch bolt. The one on the passenger side and the other side, you have to drill a new hole completely. But you're just going to use the torque arm itself as a guide. Stick the drill bit in the hole and drill your hole, nut and bolt it with the supply washers. So after you get your holes drilled, your bolts put in over here on both sides, next thing we're going to do is you got to install some shims, and these shims are what's going to set the pinion angle on the differential. What they want you to do is actually measure the crank pulley on the engine, and what you're going to do is make the angle of the pinion the exact same angle that what you get on the crank pulley. So you're going to pull the bolt out, install the shims that you need, make this angle match here what this is supposed to be, make it match what it is on the crank, tighten your bolts up. At this point, guys, that's really about it. I got to tighten up all my hardware. I can put my exhaust back on, and that's really about it. All right, so that's the Panhard bar and the torque arm install on the rear. Now we're going to hop up to the front and put in the tubular K member, the control arms, the coil-overs, all that stuff. Okay, so to get you guys up to speed, I have the front suspension disassembled, the steering rack zip tied over on the front sway bar. The cross member is essentially ready to come out. If I take the bolts out of the motor mount, the 8 bolts holding in the cross member is going to come out. What you do have to do is, if you're leaving the engine in the car, you have to use some sort of engine support to actually hold the engine in the car. So in this case, my alternator is right here on top, so I just pulled the alternator off. It's like 4 bolts. Pulled that up out of the way, and then there's 2 studs that go down here into the block, and I'm just using those on the engine support. So I've got both sides all disassembled. Everything's all ready to come apart. The cross member is ready to come out. While the cross member is out, I am going to put in a fresh oil pan gasket, because that is literally the best time to change the oil pan gasket, and I've never changed it on this car, and the car's 20 years old. So while I'm in there, I'm going to put an oil pan gasket on. So that's where we're at. I really didn't go over the disassembly portion of this, because I'm going to be frank with you guys, if you can't figure out how to disassemble this, you're never going to get the cross member out and back in correctly. So just to save some time in the video, I'm not going over this stuff. So there's a total of 8 bolts holding in the factory K member to this car. There's 2 in the spring pocket on each side, and then there's 2 more kind of at the back edge of the K member, parallel with the transmission bell housing. There's 2 on each side there. So there's a total of 8. You zip those 8 bolts out, and I just have a block of wood on top of this transmission jack, just lowering this thing down. Worked fantastic. Did it by myself, no big deal. Okay, so I got the oil pan gasket all changed. K member is on the transmission jack, ready to go up into place. I got everything under here sort of cleaned up and, you know, ready to go. Like I said, this is your best opportunity to change the oil pan gasket, you know, if you need to. So what I'm going to do now is, you know, jack the K member up into place, get it all bolted in, and then once I have it all bolted into place, the next thing I need to do is square it up. So I need to make sure that the K member is sitting square in the car and not, you know, one side further forward than the other. So this Maximum Motorsport K member has multiple advantages. First of which, the K member with their control arms is 40 pounds lighter than the stock stuff that I just removed in the last shot. In addition to that, there's far less friction in the suspension design of this Maximum Motorsport setup. So believe it or not, the ride quality is probably even better than it was stock. This car in particular had lowering springs in it, and you could stand it for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, but after that, it got pretty miserable to ride around in. So this front suspension setup, in addition to having light years better geometry, also rides better. The front end is much more responsive, and it's 40 pounds lighter. There's really zero downside to this mod. Okay, so the K member is all bolted up into place, but the next thing we got to do is make sure it's square in the chassis. So what you have to do is, first of all, come back to the back of the car, and the lower control arm, you're going to put a plumb bob over top of the bolt and put a mark on a piece of tape that's down on the floor. You're going to do that for both sides. Then you're going to take your plumb bob, come up to the front. There's 2 pre-drilled holes in the K member. You put the string through it and do the exact same thing. Get a measurement on a piece of tape. Once you have all your measurements and all your dots on the tape, what you're going to do is start taking measurements between your dots. So you're going to go long ways like this, and then you're also going to go diagonally across like so. So what you're doing is you're verifying that the front wheels are square with the rear wheels, and the car is going to track straight going down the road. So I spent more time than what I'm really willing to admit squaring the K member. I bet you it was over an hour. But when I was done, my measurements were within a 32nd of an inch from side to side and across. So obviously the car tracks down the road straight, and it's in there the way it's supposed to be in there. That's what, you know, a lot of people don't realize about doing this sort of work where you're modifying something. It's, yes, I removed 8 bolts and I installed 8 bolts, but nobody ever talks about the fact that you got to spend an hour, hour and a half, you know, putting this frame in here straight so the car drives correctly. It's the same thing with like setting bump steer. I bet you I spent 3 hours dialing in bump steer. And by the time I was done, from full droop to full compression, I had less than 30 thousandths of an inch toe change. But it took me 3 hours to figure that out. So there's a lot of time here that you guys are not seeing. And I equate it to sort of like building a house. You know what? I'm no carpenter, but I can put studs 16 inches on center with a top and bottom board and build a wall. It doesn't mean the structure is going to be square when I'm done. It's the exact same principle. Any idiot can put in 8 bolts. It takes a different kind of idiot to spend 3 hours measuring bump steer to make sure it's going to drive correctly. So even something as simple as bolting in the steering rack, if you look at the bushings that I have in the steering rack, these are no longer rubber bushings. These are solid aluminum machined bushings that are in this steering rack. There's 3 different positions that you can install them in. So depending on what position you install them in is then changing the bump steer at the wheels. So as you can see, you know, this whole procedure, guys, it sort of snowballs. Like, yeah, just looking at it, the hard parts aren't hard to bolt in. But to make everything fit and make everything work like it's supposed to takes a lot more work than what you realize. So these lower control arms that I'm using on the front actually push the wheel forward 3/4 of an inch, and the Maximum Motorsport K member pushes the wheel forward 3/4 of an inch. So the front wheel on this car is 1.5 inches closer to the front. So what I'm doing at this point is I'm putting the hub on, putting the brake rotor on so I can throw the wheel on this thing and just check for clearance everywhere. Once I have that done, I can actually go through and set my bump steer like it's supposed to be. That's the thing, guys. By moving this wheel this far forward, you may or may not have issues. It just depends on the width of the wheels that you're using, the offset of the wheels that you're using. There's just a ton of variables to this. Now at this point, you're looking at final assembly. So if you look kind of toward the top of the screen, I've got the coilover bolted up. I'm putting the rotors and the brakes on at this point, putting everything back together, and I can throw the wheel on it and finally, you know, test drive this thing. As far as my alignment, just for my initial test drive and my initial impressions, and I'm going to give you in a second, I just aligned everything with a tape measure. It actually goes to the alignment shop next week, but, you know, for this video, has a tape measure alignment on it. So the part most of you probably are waiting for is, how does this thing drive? So my initial impressions with this thing, the first thing I did obviously was I just took it on a quick trip around the block to make sure I didn't have any strange noises or anything like that. But the first thing that I noticed, even driving it like 20 miles an hour around the block, around my house, the steering response on the front of this car is absolutely night and day different. It's so much quicker, so much more direct, so much more precise. So much so that if you got in this car and I didn't tell you, you would think this car has a quick ratio steering rack in it. The geometry is that much different. It is night and day better as far as the turn-in and the steering response and things like that. Like if I'm going down the highway 60, 70 miles an hour and I sneeze and jerk the wheel a little bit, I'm gonna end up in the other lane. The steering response, like I said, is no joke. So far, I've put roundabouts 150 miles on the car since I got it done, and the biggest thing that stands out is the car doesn't do anything weird. What I mean is, when I put the car into a corner, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. The rear end follows the front end. There's no crazy understeer. There's no crazy oversteer. It behaves how it's supposed to behave. It literally drives like a different car. And the biggest thing that I notice as far as before versus after that you would notice immediately is the ride quality as well. Believe it or not, this car rides better with this suspension setup than what it did from the factory. There's so much less friction in this suspension setup and in this suspension design in this car that the springs and the shocks are actually controlling the body. The suspension doesn't have to overcome a bunch of friction before the springs and the shocks do something. So the ride quality is so much better than what it was with the drop springs and the Tokiko shocks. I'll put a full list down in the description, guys, as far as the setup on this car, if you guys are curious about it. I really set this car up to be like a long distance cruiser and just a backroads fun car. I didn't want a car that was absolutely miserable to drive. I wanted a car that I could get in it, I could drive it 3 hours, put some fuel in it, get right back in it for another 3 hours and enjoy it the whole time. With the previous setup on the drop springs and the Tokiko shocks, I could stand driving around in this thing for about 2.5 hours, but after that, the ride was pretty harsh. It was pretty miserable to just, you know, ride around in, and there was no real compliance in the suspension. It was just very stiff, and it kind of clashed and banged going over bumps and things like that because, like I said, there was so much friction in the stock suspension design. To put it in perspective, guys, I rented, like the week after I got this car done and I put some miles on it, the week after that I went out of town and I rented a S550 new body style Mustang, just the EcoBoost convertible. The ride quality in this car is on par with that car. Really, from the driver's seat, the only difference that you could tell between this car and that car as far as ride quality was mid-corner bumps. You know, obviously the IRS and the new car handled mid-quarter bumps a lot better than the solid axle that wants to skip sideways a little bit. There's no way around that. But as far as, you know, cruising down the highway, hitting, you know, going up over bridges, bridge expansion joints and, you know, potholes and things like that, it's on par with a modern S550 EcoBoost car. And this car changes direction much better than an S550 EcoBoost car. The S550 EcoBoost car, as you would imagine, is pretty soft. So when you give it some steering input real quick, the body kind of does one of these and then goes around the corner. This car, if you just jerk the wheel like that, the car just stays straight and just turns. It's fantastic. So there's really only one thing about this car that I'm not super crazy about at this point, and I have to do some work to try and fix it. So when I set up this car, I dealt with Jack at Maximum Motorsport. He's like their lead engineer, basically. He designed a lot of the parts that are on this car, and I gave him the details of what I was going to be doing with the car, and I kind of took his advice as to how to set the car up, how to make the car right, and how to achieve the goal that I wanted. And one of the things that he suggested and he kind of pushed for was the forward offset control arms that I have on the front of this car. So these forward offset control arms move the front wheels 3/4 of an inch forward, and then the K member itself moves the wheels another 3/4 of an inch forward. So my front wheels on this car are nowhere near the center of the wheel wells. So the front wheels are 1.5 inches forward from what they were stock, which creates great handling, but it also creates a bunch of clearance problems. And the frustrating part for me was the emails that I have from Jack are, there's literally zero issue, or there's literally zero reason why you shouldn't use the forward offset control arms. You may have to do some minor trimming of the bumper, but other than that, you will have no problem. Well, I gave him the details on the wheels and tires that I'm running. He said there would be no issue, and my driver's side is basically my driver's side front wheel is hitting the washer bottle over large bumps because there is a dimple in the driver's side fender liner. There's a dimple in the wheel well for the washer bottle. So when the wheel comes up to go over the bump, it hits the inside of the washer bottle because the wheel's so far forward. A little bit frustrating on my part, but what I'm gonna try to do is pull the K member back as far as I can, because when I put the K member in the car, I tried to push it forward as far as I can. When I got those measurements squaring up the K member, I tried to push it as far forward as I can and completely burned myself. So if you're running the forward offset control arms, put the K member as far back in the car as possible, or run the non-offset control arms. Overall, guys, I'm super happy with the setup. Like I said, it rides better than factory. It's 10 times more responsive than factory, and it doesn't do anything weird when you put it into a corner. So like I said, guys, down in the description, I'll put the full list as far as the setup on this car. If you guys, are interested in researching what I'm doing here and making your car compliant and handle well, I'll put all the details down in the description of basically all the parts I have here. So as always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. You want to see more content? Go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.